Judge commanded Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to leave the court, but she would return, not with anger, but with an overwhelming and silent legal fire. The courtroom air was thin and cold, smelling faintly of old paper and polished wood, a scent that always spoke to Jasmine of contained power, of decisions etched into history. She sat still, observing the proceedings, a witness to a process she understood intimately, professionally, yet often found herself positioned against, structurally. The rhythmic click of the court reporter's keys was the only consistent sound, a nervous counterpoint to the low drone of argument. Across the room, the judge, robed and elevated, embodied the institutional weight of the space. There was a tension in the room, not yet named but palpable, the kind that gathers when disparate worlds collide under a veneer of procedure. Jasmine's hands were clasped loosely in her lap, her posture outwardly relaxed, a studied calm that concealed a precise internal calibration. She wasn't a participant in this specific case, merely an observer, present to understand the application of law in a particular context relevant to her legislative work. But her presence, as a black woman in a space historically designed to exclude and marginalize, a black woman with evident power and intellect, was often a silent provocation. The judge's eyes, sharp and scanning the room, paused on her. There was a fractional hesitation before he spoke, a micro-pause that felt heavy with unspoken meaning, a slight shift in the air pressure of the room that only someone keenly attuned to such shifts would detect. His voice, when it came, was not raised, but it carried an edge, a procedural strictness that felt suddenly, unexpectedly aimed. He cited a rule, a technicality regarding observers, something about capacity or relevance, phrased in dry, bureaucratic language. It was a rule rarely, if ever, enforced in her experience, especially for a member of Congress present in an official capacity. The words themselves were innocuous enough, boilerplate legalese, but the delivery, the pointed glance, the timing, it stripped the language bare, revealing the intent beneath. It wasn't about the rule, it was about her, about the space she occupied, the power she represented, the quiet dignity she carried into a room where it was perhaps not wanted, not expected, not welcomed. The insult was delivered with the quiet authority of the bench, disguised as procedural necessity. It was the institutional equivalent of a door closing softly, but definitively in your face. Jasmine felt the words land, not as a shock, but as a confirmation of the unspoken tension that had filled the room. Her body remained still. Her face, a mask of calm neutrality, registered nothing outwardly. Internally, however, she felt the familiar low hum of adrenaline, not the rush of panic, but the steady, focused energy that comes with being targeted. She didn't immediately rise. She held the judge's gaze for a brief moment, acknowledging the directive without yielding to its implicit disrespect. Around her, she sensed a shift in the room's energy. The clicking keys paused for a beat too long. Heads turned subtly. Eyes flickered towards her, then away. A young aide, seated a few rows behind her, shifted in his seat, a silent signal of discomfort, of recognition. He knew, without her having to say anything, that this wasn't routine. This was something else. The judge repeated the instruction, his voice perhaps a touch firmer this time, leaving no room for misinterpretation, reinforcing the authority of the order. It was a test of her composure, a test of her willingness to escalate, a test of how she would respond to this quiet assertion of control, this public demand for her removal. The rules of engagement, she knew, were different for her. A loud, angry reaction would be framed as confirmation of stereotypes, as disruptive, as proving the judge's action was justified. Her power, in this moment, lay in her response, or lack thereof. She rose slowly, deliberately. Her movements were precise, economical. There was no fumbling for her brief bag, no sudden gathering of papers. Everything was already organized, controlled. The simple act of standing became a statement, not of defiance but of compliance rendered with unwavering self-possession. She didn't speak. Dialogue, in this instance, would have been a concession, an invitation to a debate on terms not her own. Her silence was a boundary, a refusal to engage with the premise that her presence was disruptive or that the rule was being applied fairly. The judge watched her, his expression unreadable, perhaps expecting a protest, a question, any flicker of the frustration or anger that the order was designed to elicit. But she offered none. She simply gathered her things, a single smooth motion, and turned towards the aisle. As she walked, she could feel the eyes on her, the lawyers at their tables, the handful of observers in the gallery, the court staff. Each step was measured, dignified. There was no rush, no lingering. She didn't slam the door behind her. She didn't make a show of her exit. She simply left the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing softly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the courtroom. Outside, the hallway was a different kind of space, less formal, less charged, though still subject to the court's authority. The aide hurried to catch up with her, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice low. She stopped and turned to him, her expression still calm. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice steady. It wasn't just an assurance, it was a statement of internal resilience. The aide nodded, but his eyes still held questions. He had seen the moment, felt the weight of it. He had witnessed the subtle act of institutional targeting and her response. Not fight or flight, but quiet withdrawal. He wasn't sure what to do next. He had expected a reaction, instructions, something. But she was simply standing there, in the hallway outside the door she had just been ordered through. The silence stretched between them for a moment, broken only by the distant sounds of the courthouse. Footsteps, the murmur of voices from other rooms, the hum of the building itself. It was in this silence that the true weight of the moment settled. It wasn't just an inconvenience, a procedural hiccup. It was a public, albeit quiet assertion of power designed to diminish her, to make her feel unwelcome, to remind her of her perceived place. It was a microaggression writ large, given the authority of the court. Her removal wasn't just from a physical space. It was an attempt at symbolic erasure, a denial of her right to observe, to witness, to exist fully in a space that had historically been a gatekeeper of power and justice, often used to deny both to people who looked like her. But the attempt had failed to break her composure. It had landed, yes, but it had been absorbed, processed. Her stillness was not passive, it was active. It was a deliberate choice not to give the aggressor the reaction they sought, not to validate the premise of their action by showing outward distress or anger. She had been ordered to leave, and she had left. But the story was far from over. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different. Freer, perhaps, but also charged with the recent expulsion. Jasmine stood for a moment, allowing the quiet indignity of the moment to wash over her, not to drown her, but to clarify her thoughts. The aide hovered nearby, still unsure of how to be useful in a situation where the usual political playbook, immediate outrage, press statement, felt inadequate, almost cheapened by the quiet precision of the insult. This wasn't a gaffe, it was a calculated move, wrapped in the sterile language of court procedure. She could feel the eyes of passers-by in the hallway, curious glances towards the recognizable figure standing outside a courtroom door. Some knew who she was. Others might have just sensed the unusual stillness, the contained energy. The aide finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Congresswoman, should we contact press? Issue a statement?" He was trying to apply familiar tools to an unfamiliar attack. Jasmine considered it for a beat. An immediate, reactive statement would be tempting, satisfying in a visceral way. It would frame the judge as clearly in the wrong, solicit public sympathy, trigger the news cycle. But it would also make the story about her reaction, about the conflict, rather than about the action itself and what it represented. It would give the judge's provocation the power to dictate the narrative. "Not yet," she said. Her voice was low, thoughtful. Let the moment breathe. This wasn't about controlling the immediate news cycle. It was about controlling the long-term understanding of what had just happened. The insult had been quiet, procedural. The response needed to be something different, something that exposed the undercurrent without resorting to shouting, matching the aggression's volume. She walked slowly towards a quieter corner of the hallway, near a large window that offered a view of the city outside. Buildings, traffic, life continuing, oblivious to the small drama unfolding within these walls of justice. The aide followed, sensing the shift from immediate processing to strategic thinking. He pulled out his phone, ready to take notes or start drafting, but she held up a hand. "First," she said, looking out the window, "we understand exactly what happened. This wasn't just about the judge telling her to leave. It was about why he felt empowered to do it, about the unspoken assumptions underlying his action, about the system that allowed such microaggressions to be delivered with the weight of law. It was about the casual erasure of her right to exist in that space, to witness, to learn, simply because her presence was perceived as a disruption to the established order, an order that had historically benefited from her absence and the absence of people like her." They talked quietly, reviewing the exact words the judge used, the specific rule he cited, the context of the case being heard. The aide, trained to document, recorded the details, but also noted her affect, the lack of visible anger, the focus on analysis. He saw how her mind was already working, dissecting the incident not as a personal affront, but as a case study in institutional behavior. This incident, she realized, was not just about her. It was a manifestation of a larger, pervasive dynamic, the subtle ways power structures attempt to maintain control, to push back against those who challenge them simply by occupying spaces they weren't meant to occupy. The judge's action, while directed at her, was also a message to anyone else who might dare to stand outside the expected lines, particularly those from marginalized communities. It was a reminder that even with position, even with authority conferred by the people, you could still be made to feel unwelcome, lesser, subject to arbitrary power disguised as procedure. The feeling of the incident, she noted, was one of quiet dismissal, of being rendered invisible despite her public role. And that, she knew, was the true weapon. Not the order to leave, but the attempt to erase her presence, her legitimacy. But you cannot erase what is rooted in truth and mandate. The initial ripple from the courtroom moment was subtle, contained within the courthouse walls. But the aide, diligent and attuned to the modern flow of information, checked social media, sensing that even a quiet, contained moment could escape confinement. And he was right. Someone in the courtroom, perhaps a member of the public or a junior lawyer, had captured a snippet, not of the verbal exchange, which was too low and dry, but of the visual. The clip was short, the judge looking towards Jasmine, her still figure, the slow, deliberate way she rose and gathered her things, her composed walk out of the room. There was no sound to capture the judge's words, only the image of her quiet compliance with an unseen order. The first posts were simple descriptions. Congresswoman Crockett asked to leave court, followed by brief speculative captions. But the image itself, the visual contrast between her stillness and the implied authority of the judge, was compelling. Online, where context is often stripped bare, the image invited interpretation. Users began filling the void with their own assumptions, their own experiences with authority, with spaces where they felt unwelcome. The lack of audio meant the moment was open to projection. Was she being disrespectful? Was the judge being heavy-handed? The questions hung in the digital air, generating initial low-level engagement. Inside a quiet office space the aide secured for them, Jasmine reviewed the early posts on the aide's phone. She watched the short loop of herself rising and walking out. It looked exactly as it felt, controlled, measured. She noticed how the camera had caught the faces of a couple of onlookers, their expressions ranging from surprise to discomfort, mirroring the subtle disruption the incident had caused in the room. That's where the story was beginning to spread, she realized, not just in the official records but in the unofficial witnessing, the shared experience of seeing someone in a position of power being subjected to a quiet assertion of authority. It was relatable on a human level, the feeling of being singled out, of being told you don't belong. But for those who knew her, who understood her work and her stature, it was more than that. It was an unsettling image. A black woman, a legislator, being ordered out of a courtroom by a white male judge. The historical echoes were undeniable, heavy. The posts began to gain traction. Small blogs picked it up. Local news outlets started making calls. The temperature of the online conversation was slowly rising, fueled by the ambiguity of the clip and the public figure involved. Comment sections became battlegrounds of interpretation, supporters defending her right to be there, critics arguing for the judge's absolute authority, others simply expressing confusion or outrage. It wasn't a wildfire yet, more like embers catching. But it was enough to signal that the moment, contained as it was, had breached the walls of the courtroom and was entering the public consciousness. And once a moment enters the public consciousness, it develops a life of its own, independent of the initial intent. The judge's quiet order for her removal was no longer just a private interaction. It was becoming a public spectacle, a Rorschach test for people's views on power, authority, and who belongs where. The power dynamic was starting to shift, not because she had fought back immediately, but because her quiet, dignified compliance had created a vacuum, allowing the public to project their own sense of justice and injustice onto the scene. Her restraint had, paradoxically, made the judge's action more visible, more open to scrutiny. As the online buzz escalated from embers to a steady glow, driven by the silent video clip and the lack of immediate official comment, the narrative began to solidify around the visual. The story, as framed by the fragmented pieces online, was about an authority figure exercising power against a public figure, specifically a prominent black woman. This framing, while incomplete without the full context, resonated deeply with existing societal tensions and historical precedents. The silence from her side was perceived in different ways, by some as stunned disbelief, by others as calculated restraint, and by a few as a sign of her being in the wrong. This ambiguity, coupled with the charged visual, was the engine driving its spread. News outlets, seeing the increasing engagement, began crafting headlines that were factual but emotionally weighted. Congresswoman Crockett asked to exit court. Judge's order sparks questions. The language was careful, but the implication was clear. Something unusual, something potentially significant had occurred. Inside the quiet office, Jasmine and her team continued their meticulous review. They weren't just watching the online reaction. They were dissecting the judge's action itself, researching the specific rules cited, examining its typical application, looking for precedents. Their focus remained on the institutional, the procedural, the legal underpinning, or lack thereof, of the judge's order. This incident wasn't going to be fought with sound bites and outrage alone. It would be fought with facts, with law, with an understanding of the system the judge operated within. They identified the weakness in the judge's position, the rarely enforced nature of the rule, the potential for selective application, the implicit question of bias given the context and her identity. This wasn't just about proving the judge wrong. It was about exposing why he was wrong, and what that exposure revealed about the power dynamics at play. Meanwhile, the online narrative was starting to coalesce around a simple, powerful observation drawn from the visual. She left with quiet dignity. Commenters noted her posture, the lack of visible distress, the controlled way she gathered her things. In a world where public figures often reacted instantly and loudly to perceived slights, her measured response stood out. It wasn't a performance of strength. It was an embodiment of it. And this observation began to shift the tone of the conversation. It moved from speculation about why she was removed to admiration for how she handled it. This was the turning point, the subtle shift in the narrative that her initial restraint had allowed. By not reacting emotionally, she had denied the aggressor the satisfaction of seeing her flustered, and had instead offered the public a canvas onto which they could project their own ideals of grace under pressure. The video clip, silent and ambiguous initially, was now being reinterpreted through the lens of her composure. It was no longer just a clip of someone being removed. It was a clip of someone embodying dignity in the face of casual institutional power. The public discourse was starting to do the work for her, highlighting the contrast between the judge's potentially arbitrary exercise of power and her unwavering self-possession. This growing recognition of her composure was building anticipation. What would she say when she finally spoke? How would she address this moment? The silence, initially a void for speculation, was now generating a powerful sense of expectation. It was a testament to the power of restraint as a form of communication, speaking volumes without uttering a single word. The stage was being set, not for a simple defense, but for a reframing, a re-education on what had truly transpired. The viral moment arrived not as a sudden explosion, but as a collective dawning of recognition, a moment when the disparate threads of the silent video, the speculative commentary, and the growing admiration for her composure converged. It wasn't a single soundbite from the courtroom, but a quote that would emerge later, a response delivered with quiet power that resonated because of the context her silence had created. While the online conversation brewed, her team had been working diligently, not on crafting an angry retort, but on building the legal and procedural argument. They were gathering the legal firepower the title hinted at. This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. Case law, procedural rules, legislative mandates that defined her right to be present, that clarified the limits of the judge's authority in this specific context. They were preparing to meet procedural aggression not with emotional counteraggression, but with irrefutable facts and established law. The moment for her statement came not in a fiery press conference, but perhaps in a quiet interview or a formal brief address. She didn't dwell on the personal slight. Instead, she focused on the principle. She spoke about the importance of transparency in the justice system, about the public's right to observe, and about the specific duties of a legislator to understand the practical application of laws they write. She acknowledged the judge's order, stating it simply, factually. But then came the turn, the subtle rhetorical shift that weaponized her earlier restraint. She didn't express outrage at being asked to leave. She expressed concern about what her removal signified for the principle of open courts and oversight. And then, the line that would become the viral quote, stripped of anger, delivered with a quiet, almost clinical precision. They may have ordered me out, citing a rule, but they cannot rule over truth or the law I was sent here to uphold. Or perhaps even more pointedly, connecting it directly to the title's promise of return. I was told I could not be in that space, so I stepped outside to ensure that when I returned, I would bring not just my presence, but the full weight of the law they sought to exclude me from. Need to choose Crockett refine the viral quote concept for the final draft, something concise and powerful related to law, truth, versus arbitrary power. Let's refine this. They ordered me to leave citing a procedural rule. What they failed to understand is that when you exclude me from observing the law, I don't just leave, I gather the law itself. This line, delivered calmly, perhaps with a slight knowing tilt of the head, carried the weight of the entire preceding drama. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. She hadn't left in defeat. She had left to prepare. She hadn't been silenced. She had merely paused to gather her voice, amplified by legal authority. The line was instantly clip-worthy. It was short, powerful, and flipped the script. The judge's action was reframed not as a successful removal, but as a tactical error that had merely sent her to retrieve greater force. It was shared across social media platforms, often with captions like, "This," or "Mic drop," or "She didn't just leave, she leveled up." The virality wasn't driven by outrage at the judge, but by admiration for her strategic response, her ability to turn a moment of apparent powerlessness into a demonstration of superior strength, the strength of preparation, of knowledge, of truth. Her composure during the exit now read not as compliance but as the quiet focus before a decisive move. The legal firepower wasn't a threat of litigation against the judge, though that might be implied. It was the power of using the law itself to dismantle the premise of his action, to assert her right to be there, and to highlight the potential abuse of authority. The viral quote became the caption for the silent video, giving meaning to the visual, turning a moment of quiet dignity into a declaration of powerful intent. The public reckoning had begun, not with her voice raised in anger, but with a single, resonant line delivered with unwavering calm. With the viral quote amplifying the public's reevaluation of the silent courtroom video, the narrative shifted definitively. It was no longer just about a judge ordering a congresswoman out. It was about an apparent abuse of power being met with a strategic, law-based response. The legal firepower wasn't just a figure of speech from a title. It was the tangible research, the procedural arguments, the legislative understanding that her team had meticulously assembled. The moment arrived for her return to the forum where this legal understanding could be brought to bear. This wasn't necessarily a dramatic courtroom confrontation with the judge who ordered her out, though related legal actions might follow. It could be a hearing where the relevant procedural rules were debated, a press conference where she detailed her findings, or even a legislative session where she addressed the broader implications of such actions. Let's envision a scenario where she addresses the incident in a formal setting, perhaps before a committee overseeing judicial conduct or transparency. She wouldn't storm in. She would enter the room with the same composed bearing she had displayed when leaving the courtroom. Her presence now carried a different weight, however, the weight of public attention, of a narrative that had been flipped. The very people who had watched the silent clip online were now tuning in, waiting to see the follow-through. She began not with accusations, but with a calm, factual account of the incident. She stated the date, the time, the location, the judge's name, and the exact rule cited. Her language was precise, devoid of emotional hyperbole. She presented the research her team had done, instances where the rule was not applied in similar circumstances, legal interpretations of the rule that supported her right to be present, legislative intent behind statutes governing public access to courtrooms. Her firepower was presented in bound documents, in carefully worded sentences, in citations of law. She spoke about the principle of open courts, the necessity of oversight, and the concerning implications when procedural rules are used in a way that appears arbitrary or discriminatory. She didn't need to explicitly accuse the judge of bias. The facts she presented, juxtaposed with the silent video clip now playing widely online, did the work for her. She spoke not just as a congresswoman, but as a lawyer, dismantling the legal basis for the judge's action with calm, irrefutable logic. She demonstrated that her presence was not a disruption, but a legitimate exercise of her duties, and that her removal was not a standard application of procedure, but a questionable use of authority. Those watching, both in the room and online, could see the contrast clearly, the potentially flimsy pretext for her removal versus the solid foundation of law and principle she was now standing on. Her arguments were delivered with the same quiet power as her exit from the courtroom. There was no yelling, no grandstanding, just the steady, relentless application of fact and law. She was winning the argument not by being louder, but by being demonstrably, undeniably right on the merits. The institutional force that had attempted to erase her was now being meticulously dismantled by her understanding and command of the very system it represented. The ripple effect of Jasmine's reframing of the narrative, fueled by the viral quote, and her subsequent presentation of the legal facts, began to reshape public understanding of the incident. What started as a seemingly simple interaction, a judge's order, a congresswoman's exit, was now widely understood as a complex interplay of institutional power, potential bias, and the quiet strength required to navigate such spaces. The public reevaluation wasn't just about deciding who was right or wrong in that moment. It was about looking deeper at the systems that enable such moments to occur. Comment sections on news articles and social media posts became less about immediate takes and more about nuanced discussion. People started researching the specific rule the judge cited, debating its applicability, sharing stories of their own experiences with arbitrary authority figures. The quiet removal from the courtroom had inadvertently sparked a broader conversation about access, transparency, and the subtle ways power is wielded in ostensibly neutral environments. Media coverage shifted from simply reporting on the incident to analyzing its implications. Legal experts weighed in, often siding with Jasmine's interpretation of the rules and questioning the judge's actions. Editorials were written not just about the personalities involved, but about the principles at stake. The importance of a truly open judiciary, the challenges faced by individuals, particularly those from marginalized groups, when navigating institutional spaces, and the power of procedural fairness. The silent video clip was now viewed through the lens of her later words and actions. Her composed exit was reinterpreted not as resignation, but as strategic withdrawal. The lack of immediate reaction was seen as discipline, as the necessary quiet before the storm of legal truth. The dignity she embodied in that moment became a powerful symbol, contrasting sharply with the perceived smallness of the action taken against her. This reevaluation extended beyond the public sphere into the institutional one. While the judge might not face immediate overt repercussions, the incident was now part of his record, subject to potential review by judicial oversight bodies. Other judges, court personnel, and even lawyers became more aware of the scrutiny such actions could attract, more mindful of the appearance of fairness and the reality of equal access. The incident served as a quiet warning shot, a reminder that even in the seemingly impenetrable world of the courtroom, actions taken under the guise of procedure could be exposed and challenged, not through emotional outcry, but through clear, factual, and legal rebuttal. Jasmine herself became a symbol of this particular form of resistance. Not loud, not aggressive, but rooted in a deep understanding of systems and a quiet, unyielding commitment to truth and fairness. The emotional ripple effect was significant for those who had witnessed the initial incident, both in the courtroom and online. For the aide who had seen her calm exit, it was a lesson in a different kind of power. For the onlookers in the courtroom, their initial discomfort had given way to a sense of vindication as the narrative unfolded. For the countless strangers who had watched the clip and heard her subsequent words, it was a powerful demonstration that dignity under scrutiny is not passive, but an active, potent force. The reevaluation wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional, affirming the power of restraint and the ultimate victory of truth and legal competence over arbitrary authority. The emotional ripple effect extended far beyond the immediate circle of the courtroom and the online sphere, settling into a deeper layer of public consciousness. People who had never heard of the specific procedural rule the judge cited, or the intricacies of legislative oversight, found themselves touched by the human core of the story, the quiet dignity in the face of a public, albeit understated, attempt at dismissal. Jasmine's composure became the central image, more resonant than any angry outburst could have been. It became a reference point in conversations about navigating difficult situations, about responding to microaggressions not with matching energy, but with centeredness and strength. The image of her silent, composed exit, now imbued with the meaning provided by her subsequent, powerful articulation of her rights in the law, served as a visual metaphor for a different way of asserting power, not through volume or aggression, but through stillness, knowledge, and strategic clarity. This wasn't just about a legal or political victory. It was about a moral one, played out on a public stage. The audience, initially drawn in by the potential for conflict, found themselves instead witnessing a masterclass in restraint and dignity. This provided a unique emotional reward, a feeling of witnessing justice served not through punitive measures against the aggressor, though accountability might follow, but through the inherent power of truth and self-possession prevailing. It was vindicating for anyone who had ever felt unfairly treated by an authority figure, offering a template for a response that felt both powerful and morally upright. Her choice to counter procedural power with legal power, rather than emotional power, elevated the discourse and highlighted the sophistication of her approach. It required the audience to engage on a deeper level, to understand the rules of the system she was operating within, and to appreciate the skill required to use those rules to dismantle an unjust action. The comment fodder evolved from simple reactions to the viral clip, to discussions about the nature of respect, the application of laws, and the quiet persistence required to push back against institutional inertia or bias. People debated her specific phrasing, analyzed the strategic timing of her response, and shared their own insights into the dynamics of power and resistance. Her story became an example cited in articles and discussions about leadership, communication, and social justice, demonstrating that true power often lies not in the ability to dominate, but in the ability to remain centered and strategically effective under pressure. The reflective closure for the audience came not from a definitive, externally imposed resolution to the judge's action, which might be slow or internal to the judiciary, but from the completeness of Jasmine's response. She had been challenged. She had withdrawn with dignity. She had gathered her strength, legal knowledge, and she had returned to articulate the truth of the situation, thereby correcting the record and educating the public. The arc of the story was satisfying because the response was so perfectly calibrated to the nature of the initial offense, a quiet, procedural insult met with a quiet, procedural, but overwhelmingly powerful truth. It left the audience not necessarily with a feeling of triumphant victory over a defeated enemy, but with a deeper appreciation for the quiet power of integrity and competence in the face of casual injustice. The quiet power of the moment lingered, echoing in the hallways of the courthouse and the broader public discourse long after the initial news cycle had faded. Jasmine's reflection on the incident was not one of lingering resentment, but of quiet resolve. She saw it not as a personal attack, but as a stark illustration of the forces she was constantly navigating, the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways in which power structures attempted to maintain control by excluding or diminishing those who challenged the status quo simply by existing within it. The judge's order, intended to remove her from the space, had ultimately failed to remove her from the conversation. In fact, it had amplified her voice, albeit in a way he could never have anticipated. Her quiet exit and subsequent measured response had flipped the script, turning a moment designed to assert his authority into a powerful demonstration of her own, derived not from position alone, but from knowledge, composure, and moral clarity. The legal firepower wasn't a one-time blast. It was her inherent understanding of the system, her ability to wield facts and law as tools for truth and accountability. It was a renewable resource, always available to counter attempts at erasure or dismissal. The incident became a part of her public story, not as a moment of victimhood, but as a testament to her strength and strategic intelligence. It reinforced her image as someone who could not be easily rattled, who met challenges with a focused, unwavering determination rooted in principle. The visual symbol of her calm, deliberate walk out of the courtroom remained potent, a quiet defiance more powerful than any shouting match. It reminded people that resistance doesn't always have to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes the most impactful response is one of centered, dignified refusal to be pulled into someone else's chaotic energy. The aide who had witnessed the initial moment carried a deeper understanding of what it meant to work alongside her. It wasn't just about managing schedules and drafting press releases. It was about being part of a larger mission that often involved navigating complex, subtle power dynamics with grace and intelligence. Other onlookers in the courtroom, initially unsure, later expressed their quiet admiration, having seen the full arc of the story unfold. The incident served as a microcosm of the larger struggles for justice and equity, illustrating how institutional power can be used to perpetuate exclusion, but also how it can be challenged and redefined through dignity, knowledge, and persistent truth-telling. The reflective closure wasn't about forgetting the incident, but about integrating it into a larger understanding of resilience and resistance. It underscored the importance of knowing your rights, of staying grounded in the face of provocation, and of using the tools available, including the often underestimated power of composure and truth, to push back against injustice. Her story became a quiet lesson in power, who wields it, how it's challenged, and how true strength is often found not in asserting dominance, but in upholding dignity and truth, even when told to leave the room. If this story moved you, share it, not to go viral, but to remind people what dignity looks like.